Good evening, everyone. We've got Josh Goodrich with us today, who's just an expert in instructional coaching, so developing teachers into becoming more expert. We're super excited about this. Just so happens that Josh, as a local boy, worked in England apparently a few years ago as well. So yes. So Josh, if I can hand over to you, I'm super excited for this.
Cool. I am excited also. That me working at Immingham is not strictly true, but I'll explain. So firstly, hi everyone. How are you all doing? Thank you so much for being here. My name is Josh. Last year up until August, I worked for Oasis as an English teacher and assistant head teacher at South Bank, which is a school on the South Bank of Central London. One of the other Oasis schools is Oasis Academy Immingham, which Lou used to work for. And I was also like CPD lead for the trust, but I have left that life behind me. And I am now just basically work for, I'm the founder and CEO of Powerful Action Steps and StepLab. The idea behind these two web platforms are basically to make instructional coaching, which is pretty difficult to do, difficult for schools to get right, difficult for coaches to get right, as easy as possible. Now, I'm kind of going to talk about instructional coaching today, or as part of this talk, but I think maybe we can dig more into kind of like the nuts and bolts of coaching in the questioning part, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we can bring about lasting teacher change. Some of this stuff, I'm going to be honest, is on the experimental side. It's sort of thinking about just now rather than sort of completed thoughts, for which I apologize. But I'm kind of doing this because I'm attempting to write a book. And so you are the very first people I've shown some of these ideas to. And so your feedback and thoughts about it would be really, really appreciated. So how can we bring about lasting teacher change? Like with most things where I think about it for longer than I would like, basically I find out that Mary Kennedy has said it much better than me in a single sentence. She says this: for teachers, enacting any idea is not a matter of simple adoption, but rather a matter of figuring out whether, when, and how to incorporate that new idea into an ongoing system of practice, which is already satisfactory and may also be largely habitual. In other words, Kennedy is saying it's not just as easy as telling teachers to get better. It's not as easy as giving teachers some new knowledge. Teachers, to say they have learned something, need to figure out whether they're going to do it at all, which is a motivational issue, when they're going to do it, which is a contextual issue, how to do it, which is basically a mental models and a knowledge issue. And they might not even want to do it because a lot of teachers think that the way they're doing it is right. And even if they wanted to change, there are significant habit barriers which stop us from changing. In other words, helping teachers to get better is really, really difficult to do. So I'm going to try and talk about how I think it's best to do that, and then that will feed into kind of some ideas about coaching at the end. Question one, when we're aiming to make teachers better, what does that even mean? What are we aiming to change? Peps McRae says, teacher expertise can be simply defined as responding to classroom problems in a way that means students learn more. So I think that's kind of a nice, useful way of breaking down what we're trying to look at here. We have problems in the classroom. The way that teachers respond to those problems can either help student learning to happen or not really do much, or in fact, sometimes hinder student learning. So when we're aiming to change teacher practice, we're really looking at the ways teachers respond to the classroom problems that they face. Now, I think that's also quite an interesting way of framing instructional coaching. So basically, instructional coaching is the idea that we go and watch someone's lesson and do some diagnosis. And when we do that, we are diagnosing a classroom problem that they have, or a kind of like one of the classroom problems that we think it's most important to help them solve now. When we give people kind of an action step or something to work on, we're essentially helping them to develop a new response to that problem. And the idea behind it is that it aids student learning, which is the point of like working with evidence-based practice. So the action steps are like, the reason why we use them is to help in some way improve student learning. Now, so if we think that then, like how we can define successful teacher change, then I think like the way PEP suggests that we do it is saying something like successful teacher change means the teacher solves a classroom problem in a way that helps students to learn more effectively. Now, I'm going to give you an example. This is sort of cobbled together from like lots of coaching I've done in the past, but a very common problem which I have worked with lots of teachers with, which is basically students disrupting in the kind of like the part of a lesson where the tone is set in the silent do now, which is something which we have at South Bank and really insist on. So at the start of a lesson, this teacher wants to do some 10 minutes of silent quizzing. And what happens is some students are disrupting this section of the lesson by talking. Now, this teacher has a current way they respond to this problem. And actually, I've cobbled together like what two teachers, kind of two different teachers I've worked with have done to respond to that. So teacher number one is super friendly and approachable, goes over and has a friendly word, and that doesn't work. And teacher number two kind of does the opposite and goes straight for the sending out. Now, neither of those solutions to that problem are the most effective. Teacher number one is going to get walked all over. Teacher number two is going to make everyone hate them and doesn't really want to be doing that. So what I tend to do is give them, as a result of coaching, an action step which is a little bit like this. Which boiled down to go over and it's time to sanction this student because they've broken a fundamental rule and you need to act tough and do something about it. But slightly more complex is explain the sanction in a way that doesn't completely turn the student off. So something like, look, John, you were talking during silent work and we know that's a demerit because it means that you and other students around you can't concentrate on your learning, but you were doing some fantastic work yesterday. So keep it up, pen in hand. Like pretty classic, not super difficult, but very difficult for the students who either really want to be everyone's mate or send people out at the drop of a hat. So that's the change we're trying to help this teacher make. And we know we want to do that because making that change should benefit the learning of that student and other students because it helps students to attend to their learning. They can benefit from the retrieval practice and it's really clearly stating the cost of non-compliance. So we probably know that helping a teacher to make that change is likely to be something which benefits the learning of students in the class. We've chosen the right action step. We do feedback with a teacher. We kind of help them to enact that step and then a number of things can go wrong. And all of these are things, this is again cobbled together. Like, just because we've worked with a teacher on that change doesn't mean they're going to be able to make it. These are some of the things that have gone wrong when I've tried to help teachers do that in the past. Now, not all at once, but basically problem number one, the teacher does the thing, but does it at completely the wrong time. So we know that the closer the sanction is to the actual event, the more likely it is to work. So that's not going to be very successful. The student's probably forgotten. By that time, they've disrupted all the students. It's too late. Two, you tell the teacher to sanction someone and they sanction the wrong student, which obviously causes everyone to kick off. It's a disaster. Three, they do it, but it's like we've all been there and either done it ourselves or seen someone do it. The sort of like slightly point scoring, particularly if the student they're sanctioning has like really made their life miserable for a large period of time. That's not going to work. Or they do it in a really harsh way without doing the, come on, you're fantastic, back to work part. So that doesn't work as well as it might. Or they do it, and then the following lesson, they don't do it again. So can we really say that a teacher has made a lasting change if we try to help them get better and one of these five things happens? Well, probably not. So we probably need to redefine what it means for a teacher to successfully change and then think really hard about how we can help to the teacher to make a change in a more lasting way. So successful teacher change means PEPS's definition. Teacher solves a classroom problem in a way that helps students learn more effectively, but we also need to add the following. So when we help teachers to develop a solution to a problem in class, we need to make sure that they can apply that solution at the right time, in the right place, to the right people, contextually appropriately. We need to make sure that they do it and understand why they're doing it, so that they don't like take a part of it and bend it out of shape in a way that it doesn't work. That's the kind of purposeful part. You understand that you're doing this to achieve the following thing. They need to do it accurately. So there's no point giving someone an action step, something to work on, and then they kind of do it but tweak it so much that it's no longer the thing. It doesn't really achieve the purpose. And kind of almost most importantly, they need to not just do it once. They need to do it whenever that problem arises. So, teacher change actually is quite a complex thing, and like getting all those things into place for a teacher is quite a difficult thing to do. So how do we do it? How do we help teachers to make a change that is timely, contextually appropriate, purposeful, accurate, recurrent? It's a serious challenge, and it makes me think that some of the kind of conceived wisdom about instructional coaching needs to be kind of amended. So I've been working on something which at the moment I'm going to call, in lieu of a snappier title, the 5 gateways of lasting teacher change. So we want a teacher to make the change which is in the center of the screen right now, i.e. learn to give a student a demerit at the right time, in a fair way that explains why they're doing it and then gets that student back on task. And to help a teacher do that, we need to care about the following 5 things. The first of them is perception. Perception is the idea that to make a change in a way that really works, we need to perceive the cues within a situation that trigger the need to use the action step in the first place. Now, if we think back to this teacher we're working with, like the appropriate cue is a student disrupting the do now. But like, if the teacher doesn't already perceive that cue, giving it to them, teaching them to perceive it is a pretty difficult thing to do. They need to understand that the period of the do now, like the first 10 minutes of the lesson, is a period in which they would look for that cue. They need to be able to scan the class and know what behaviors which do and don't kind of trigger the action step look like, i.e. students with their heads down and their pens moving is not going to trigger it, but there are certain things which you would look for, I call them labels, which would trigger it. Now, I don't think in instructional coaching we focus on perception enough. The second kind of gateway of teachers making a lasting change is we need to look at the teacher's goals. The teacher needs to want to make the change, even though there are potential costs to that change. So if this teacher wants to be everyone in the class's mate and didn't come into the game of teaching to give people demerits, which is certainly how I felt about teaching when I win my first maybe year or two, then there is a real opportunity cost for them to want to do that. And we need to kind of identify that and help them deal with it. And even more importantly, does the teacher understand the overall purpose of the change in their context, i.e. the idea that giving a demerit in a fair way is the best thing for every other student in the class, and why they would do the reset at the end, etc. The next important part of lasting teacher change is the idea that the teacher really has an understanding of the step they're going to take. So we can give them an action step, but do they have a really clear mental model of that strategy, the kind of active ingredients or component parts of that strategy, and a mental model of where they are, so that they can understand like the gap between where they want to get and where they are now. And I think, teachers need to have mental models of all those things to make an effective lasting change. The next 4th gateway of lasting teacher change is about the insights that surround a change that we want a teacher to make. We can't really develop expert teachers unless they understand the mechanisms by which the things they do in the class work. To nick another Pepsism, it's about understanding what's going on under the hood of what you're doing. And if we don't understand that, then we're really only able to apply the change in a very, very specific circumstance, when actually we want to make people understand that this thing they're doing can be applied in slightly different ways in lots of different circumstances. That's what expert teaching looks like. And finally, perception, goals, step knowledge or mental models, insights, and then we need teachers to develop effective habits. Effective habits basically means that the thing they perceive triggering the change they want to make at the right time in appropriate circumstances, and not something else getting triggered. For example, if we've probably all been there and or know a teacher who like sends out like all the time, get out, that kind of thing. That is a habit, right? That teacher probably doesn't want to do that, and they actually want to do something else, but they're habituated to do one particular thing. So these, I think, are the 5 gateways of actually making a lasting change. Before I talk about how I might actually go about coaching someone to do that, we'll talk about a little bit of the theory that underpins this model. So, number 1, perception. Perception is in the reading on expertise, teacher expertise is really important part, but I don't think it's trickled down enough into kind of the everyday narrative of CPD and teacher education. And I think it's time for us to really start thinking about making perception an important part of CPD. This is how perception is defined in the literature. It's basically about seeing the things that matter, understanding what they mean in that context, and then simulating a solution that will solve that problem and then actually doing it. It's quite complex. I think in my first year as a teacher, there would just be large parts of the lesson when people tried to help me get better, which was a difficult thing to do, which I just didn't have a clue what happened. A student once got out of their seat, walked across the classroom, locked themselves in my cupboard, and I didn't see it. And I think that's because teachers, especially more novice teachers, get so wrapped up in looking at the wrong things. There's a seriously large amount of sensory input when we're trying to teach. And being an expert is about seeing just the right things and ignoring most of what's happening in the classroom. I think, everyone sees stuff when they're teaching. We need to help teachers see the right stuff. The second, goals. This is another quote from Mary Kennedy. So actually, Kennedy doesn't really like classic instructional coaching because she thinks in a teach like a champion-y way, it's very, very focused on teacher moves. And she thinks that when we obsess about the moves of teaching, we kind of ignore the purposes. So what happens is that novices and other teachers enact moves for the wrong reasons. Kennedy thinks we need to be way more focused on the purposes of why we do what we do when we train teachers. And although I don't agree with her about instructional coaching or moves being a good focus of CPD, I do agree with her that we need to give primacy to teachers understanding the why as well as the what. Grossman, who is, if you haven't read, I'm going to put the references up at the end and I can send out some stuff if you want. If you haven't read Grossman on modeling, she is, and on kind of what it means to give teachers a move, she's the one. And she says, so Grossman's idea is that to learn to make a change, we basically need to represent the change, i.e. show the thing we want the teacher to do in its entirety. This looks like this. We then need to decompose the change. In other words, to say, well, actually what I'm doing in this move here is I'm trying to be really assertive. But I'm trying also to be warm. I am explaining to students really clearly the rationale behind it, the component parts of what effective change looks like. And then we help the teacher to approximate that. In other words, basically mimic it at first. That's what it means to help teachers to enact a move. Finally, insights. Back to PEPs. So PEPS basically says that if we want change to actually be flexible, in other words, to develop what we call adaptive expertise, we need to help teachers not only to make a change, to enact a move, but to understand like the mechanism behind how the move works, what's going on under the hood of the change. Again, if we don't give teachers this, although they may be able to kind of basically mimic the move in exactly the context that we teach it, they're not going to be able to use that move in a flexible way, i.e. if the situation changes slightly, they're not going to understand that like there's current under it, which is actually the bit which does the work. And finally, the simplest, I think there's lots of people have read this paper. It's Sims, Hobbes and Allen on habits. And basically they say that a fundamental and probably the main reason why knowledge-based teacher education doesn't work is that we have all got these habits which like block our path in terms of making a change. So to help a teacher, to recap, help a teacher get better, we need to figure out, to make lasting change, the perceptive things they need to focus on, the goals, do they care about the change and do they understand the why? Do they have a clear mental model of the change and in its component parts? Do they understand what's going on under the hood of the change? And how can we help them to make that change into a habit? So the question then is, how does instructional coaching fit into this? So in a series of like these 4 blog posts on coaching, which are the first thing I've blogged about in ages, because I've no longer in the classroom, so lots more time, are basically, I'm talking about responsive coaching. Now, often when we coach, we just care about what's on the y-axis here, which is essentially we go into the classroom, we do diagnosis, and we identify somewhere on here, there's loads of problems the teacher's facing. We identify, here's the problem we want them to solve, which in this case is students are walking all over them during the do now, and we need to help them give a demerit, basically. Now, the second axis of coaching, the bit which kind of turns it into needing to be a responsive practice, is like which of these mechanisms does the teacher need us to give them to help them make a change? Do we need to help the teacher to kind of perceive the right elements in the classroom which would trigger that change in the first place? Does the teacher even want to make a change, and do they understand the purpose of doing it? Does the teacher have a really clear mental model of what they might do to solve that problem, or do we need to give it to them and explain exactly how it works? Does the teacher have the right insights about behavior management for them to make the change? And finally, like, what do we need to do to help them make that into a habit? Now, the reason why I think this is kind of a responsive practice is that I don't think that you need to give every teacher every single one of these. Lots of teachers are really, really good at perceiving their environment and would perceive the cues and would know, like, I know the purpose of this change, and would have a mental model of it and may understand the insight. And all we really need to do to help them get better is to help them do practice. On the other hand, lots of teachers, not only novices, would need the whole thing. So the question really now is, how do we help? How can we coach in a way that kind of identifies teacher need and responds to it? I'm slightly nervous about this part because this is kind of just been in my brain, might not be right. Yeah, in fact, it's probably likely not to be right, and I'm really keen to get feedback about it. So this is my idea for responsive coaching. All right. So what we do when we start to coach is we do a kind of 2-stage process, which is basically at each one of these gateways of teacher expertise, we need to check whether we think there is a problem. So I'm coaching an imaginary teacher who needs to respond to non-compliance during their do now. And I'm going to say something like, okay, so during your do now, tell me about the moment where you were doing the register. Like, did you notice anything that the students were doing? Now, what I'm trying to do there is basically check if the teacher can describe the event which I have seen, especially focusing on the salient features. Now, although it's not going to be perfect, like them answering that question in a very robust way probably means that they have the right perceptive abilities. If they really can't, then essentially I need to stop and I need to do some work on teacher perception before I move on. And that would look something like one or more of the following coaching moves. Firstly, just explaining what you see. So I noticed actually that, that during your do now, 5 students in the front 2 rows were basically talking the whole time. The second thing would basically is to help the teacher to label that event, even if they weren't able to do it at the time. So what do you think would have been important things to notice? And also, like, what were you doing that you could actually ignore during the do now? So I was really focused on the fact that my projector wasn't bright enough. Actually, like, what do you need to be doing during the do now, and what do you need to be looking for? I need to be standing in the front right corner, looking for, students who are writing and/or students who are basically not. And then basically helping them to understand what the impact is of the things which they didn't manage to see. So when you were working with your projector and students were talking, what was the impact on the other students in the lesson? Well, I actually think that the impact probably was that they were all distracted. Why do you think it had this effect? Because essentially there's students in the front talking. Like, that would be the full amount of work that I would do with a teacher on helping them to develop situation awareness or perception. Then I would move to my goal check. So basically I would ask the teacher, like, what do you want to achieve in this area of your practice? So that we now are in a place where we all we agree that there's been this problem. Students are talking when they're not meant to. And I'd be like, well, what do we need to do about this? Now, again, if the teacher can clearly outline what they want to change, I think I probably need to, at this point, like, just be a lot stricter and really rapidly sanction these students to stamp that behavior out, and then we can all move on. And then again, we probably don't need to do too much work on developing or thinking about that teacher's goals. On the other hand, if they're not that clear on it, I'd probably need to do some coaching at that point. One thing I would do is just basically summarize what I want the teacher to work on myself. I might also remind the teacher about why is that an important goal based on what happened in the lesson. I might talk a little bit about the impact of achieving that goal or not achieving that goal. And if I actually felt like there was a problem with the teacher's motivation to change, I would do something else. Like, that requires other work, and I haven't quite elucidated what that looks like yet. So that's why I've written move to the motivation toolkit there, because I haven't done that work yet. But basically there would be some motivation heavy moves that coach would do. The next point, so let's just say that we've moved on past each one, right? So this is a teacher who really clearly perceives the right things, really clearly knows what they want to change and why, or I haven't, and I've done some of these moves. The next bit is, does the teacher have a clear idea of what the steps should look like, very specifically how it would work? So I would then say, okay, so specifically what do you need to do to address this issue? And if they can describe it, I'd be like, great, show me what that looks like. And if they can then do that perfectly, again, I don't need to do modeling because the teacher already has a mental model of the change they need to make. On the other hand, if I don't feel like that's the case, at this point, I would set the action step, share the criteria of the action step. So basically break it down into its individual component parts. I would model the action step. I would model the component parts of the action step. I might model what happened in the lesson or show them some video. And then we would basically do some work analyzing the gap between reality and where they want to get. That's kind of like the whole gamut of what Pam Grossman says you need to do when you basically give teachers an action step to work on. I might just do some of those things. I then probably would want to check whether the teacher had those kind of under the hood insights. So again, basically, how does this step work? Like, let's say you enact this right. How is it going to make how is it going to improve student learning? And again, it may or may not decide to really drill down into the purpose, the theory, and specific cases where that step may or may not work. So for example, a focus on the purpose of the step. This model of the learner, I haven't quite got my head around yet, but I think I'm basically going to show Willingham's mental model and basically be like, where on here does achieving this step work. I think that's probably a pretty good diagnostic. Basically, look, like here's a pretty simple mental model of how learning works. Like when you're working to get students to pay attention during the do now, what's the active process which is going to help you cause learning here? And if they can identify it, again, you probably don't need to do too much work. You could explicitly state what the theory is, and then you could drill down into past and future cases where that step would have been appropriate and will be appropriate in the future. Again, lots of the literature talks about this thing called case knowledge in teacher expertise, which is really, really, really important. Basically, like where in the past would doing this have been a good thing for you to do, and where might you use it in your future lessons? And then finally, we may or may not have had to do work on steps and insights. I would say that every single teacher, no matter who they are, needs work in the habits kind of gateway to help them make change. So again, some questions here, like what classroom event is the right cue for you to use this step? I think this is kind of a neglected question in coaching. Like we just go like, let's do practice. And actually we need to be like, well, what would even trigger you to do this in the classroom in the first place? And then the second one is about, do they know what implementation stuff they need to do to make that change? And again, here are some of the moves which I would do to help a teacher build habit. One of them is like right step, right time. Like what do you need? When's the cue for this? What do you need to see? Then I would do some preparing to practice. So basically, what work do we need to do before we can practice this? Which class, which resource are we going to look at? Which lesson are we going to enact the change on? And then we do kind of the deliberate practice cycle, practice, feedback, maybe making the practice harder. And then we do some implementation stuff to potentially help them to kind of monitor their own progress and put stuff in place. So the idea behind this really is like that you may, as a coach, be required to do either some or all of these moves, potentially not all, I'm not quite sure how that's going to work yet, to help a teacher make a change. You may need to help a teacher build their perception. You may need to help them understand why they're doing what they're doing. You may need to help them build the mental model of change. You may need to help them to understand the mechanism, and you very likely will have to help them build a habit. And what I want to work on is basically help coaches to use these diagnostic questions to kind of drive the moves that they do as part of coaching. That's kind of this project that I'm working on. And then to finish, I think that's pointing to us needing to think about teacher expertise in a little bit of a different way. I don't think I'm guilty of this in like lots of the writing that I do. Basically, like there's experts, there's novices, and like there's something in between. But I think that it's much more helpful to think of teacher expertise not as like this continuous blob, like you either are or you aren't, but actually as something which is really complex and composite. Like a teacher can be an expert in this aspect of their practice. In other words, they see the right stuff, they understand it, they know how to do, all they need to do to address that problem. But with this problem here, a teacher isn't an expert, and in fact may well need you as a coach to do significant amounts of work to develop their expertise in that area. In other words, like, and I haven't quite got my head around this yet, I think kind of in every single problem that a teacher can face, they can be at varying levels of expertise, or basically have a varied ability to change in that area. It's not very helpful for coaches or for teachers to think like, well, I'm an expert, I need this kind of coaching. Well, I'm a novice, I need this kind of coaching. I think actually we need to be like, what's the problem you're facing? And do you have the ingredients you need to make a change in this area? If you do, great, let's do practice. If you don't, I'm going to work with you as your coach to put them in place. But I am aware there's probably some more work for me to do to flesh that out into a working theory. And that is me finished. What do I do now?
Okay, so now we have Q&A, and I've got a feeling there might be a few Q&A. So, Jake gonna come in and take over? No. Rightio. So
does the mic work?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Oh, you're there. Oh,
Can you
gosh,
hear me?
panicked. Yes. Are you going to take back control?
Yeah, let me try to do that.
Do I stop sharing my screen now? I'm not.
Yes.
I'm okay. It stopped.
Don't shut it off though, Josh. Don't.
No. Okay.
Wow, Josh. Wow. Absolutely wow. Right. Questions, please. Anybody got any questions, please, for Josh? I'm sure you have.
18 questions. So
Okay. Thank you.
I won't ask all 18, I promise. I'll ask 7. I'm really interested. I suppose this isn't probably a firmed up question. It was really just on the tail end of what you've said. So I probably haven't just unpacked a complete question. So forgive me if it's not fully articulate. I'm really interested in your take on, and I don't want to use the word expertise because I quite like the fact that you move away from that to the ability to change. I suppose what makes an effective coach to be able to develop. So if we're looking at aspects of expertise as teachers, if we want to move away from that, and instead we're saying, actually, with effective instructional coaching, everybody, that's a possibility for everybody. We're not talking about whether you can be a good, an effective teacher or an ineffective teacher. Everybody's on that spectrum. What are then the active ingredients, in your opinion, based on what you've read so far, of what makes an effective coach? Because so much of that, I suppose, is heavily reliant on the skill set of the coach to begin with. And I think I'm quite interested in how we ensure that our coaches are first class to be able to do that work.
Yeah, it is definitely a question that is on my mind, because what I don't want to do is develop this fairly theoretical coaching model and then it ends up being too unwieldy for anyone to use it. I'm pretty convinced. I've used it myself, and and I also think that I use it before I knew I was using it, because that is kind of that's kind of part of me developing some expertise in coaching. But yeah, I think coaching should be kind of about much more not more diagnostic, but it needs basically the skill is basically 2 kinds of diagnosis. The first kind is actually the overhyped kind, which is the kind of leverage leadership kind, which is diagnosing the highest leverage action point, action step, which I really don't agree with. I think probably it's likely that anyone, I think doing that kind of what actually matters most is really hard. It's a proper, it's a mega coaching skill. And I find I'm in a lesson, I don't really know what to pick. And I've, coached thousands of people. The second kind, which I think we can teach and should teach more importantly, is diagnosis of what teachers need to be able to make the change. And that's kind of the work I'm trying to do. It's essentially these key diagnostic questions which probe into all the 5 things which I talked about, and then also knowing what the answer means. And I think because I'm into mechanizing coaching anyway, I think there's a bit of mechanization work that I can do. So once I get this model nailed down, I'm going to basically be feeding coaches the questions that I think they need to ask. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to mechanize how they respond. But I think that's where the training comes in. Is when a teacher describes so to pick perception, when I ask a teacher, did you notice? Or I noticed, tell me about it. That's the kind of question I would ask. What does it mean for them to describe it in a way that I think we don't need to do any work on this? That is a question which I don't really fully know the answer to yet, but that's the kind of answering that I think will tell me and us what coaches need to do.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, Josh, I'm going to start with Sarah's question. Sarah said, how do you help the teacher break old habits and maintain the new ones that you've started?
So breaking old habits is complex. There's kind of 2 facets to helping break old habits. One of them is just repeated deliberate practice. So identifying the critical cue basically, if they have a habit that is that hard to break, there'll be something that cues that habit. So for example, for me, it was always like, I had a really bad habit of shh, which like I managed to break, but it killed me. Like I perceived it every time it happened, and it made me really unhappy. So I had a shushing habit, and there was always something which like caused me to do it. And it was essentially like, you know, me hearing something when I'm explaining. So like, that's a really easy cue to identify. And it's actually quite an easy cue to use in practice, right? Because in the practice situation, I explain, the person I'm practicing with, you know, does some interrupting, and like I re-cue my preferred habit, which could be a non-verbal or could be a self-interrupt or something like that. And like doing that lots of times is likely to be effective in helping to break a bad habit. The second part of facet is implementation planning. And like, so essentially helping the teacher to put stuff in place by which they remember to make that change. Sometimes it's as easy as planning like a what, where, you know, like really specifically planning like what, where, when, why, and how of the change. But I think for a habit like the one I said, like me shushing, probably like putting reminders up around the classroom or on their slides or at the back of the room. So like a really big poster that says don't shush, so they're looking at it. Video, someone just wrote video recording the lesson, like all that kind of stuff. So that was the first thing, is how we help teachers to break and maintain. Basically cued deliberate practice and implementation planning. The second part of Sarah's question was, maintain. Was that right? I think it was. So to maintain the change.
Yes, sorry, it was to maintain. How do you maintain it? Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's the thing. We really don't, we're not very good at it in instructional coaching land. Like instructional coaching, the narrative of coaching is very much like, what's next, what's next, what's next. And so I think we're really missing like what we know about in student learning, which is like, if you always do what's next and change the learning objective, like students are going to forget what they worked on in the past. I think it's a big flaw in currently how we do instructional coaching, this kind of idea of like a different thing every week or whenever they achieve it. I think we basically need to have periods where we do like interleaved practice of old action steps. And I think that we need to help coaches to know what to pick. Like, again, it's something which I'm going to engineer. I was chatting to Peps about this quite recently. We're basically going to, so like I work with someone for like 6 weeks and do 6 action steps in week, or 5 weeks in week 6. Rather than doing a coaching observation, I probably will look at their lesson, look at the action steps I've set and be like, what has stuck? Not that one, not that one, and not that one. So rather like, don't do normal coaching feedback, right, we're not going to talk about your lesson. We're going to do like interleave practice of the action steps, which I don't think you've been successful in maintaining. Right. And so I think like there's a component of that which we need to bring into coaching, which isn't there now. I think coaching can be quite like a performance thing, and we need to do a bit more to make sure that it's about learning as well, long-term learning.
Natasha would like to ask, what current coaching research would you recommend that outlines the impact of using coaching for both teacher development and student outcomes, additional to what's already been highlighted, I think she said.
Okay, cool. I'm really bad at remembering names of research, but I know that like so firstly, a really good place to look actually, which I'll put in the chat, is like Sam Sims has done like a really good coaching, like an amazing research summary about instructional coaching, basically where he summarized all the best research into one useful place, because that's the kind of man he is. And so I put that in the chat. The second thing, if you want to dig into some of the papers within here, is like the really big one is Craft's paper. I'm going to try and be really good at doing this live. Craft instruct. So Matthew Craft has done like a really big meta study, and that's like, here we go. I've actually found it in time. So that's getting put in the chat as well. There's loads. And then the third and final would probably be one by Julie Cohen called Simulated Practice. And that in that paper, It's got a really big effect size for coaching, but like it's a weird paper where like they do practice with a computer. So like they train teachers they have like these student avatars. So teachers like practice behavior management with like fake computerized students and then receive coaching about it, which is kind of a cool paper to read. And that had a big effect size. I can't find it, but it's called Simulated Practice and it's by Julie. Those three, look at Sam Sims, look at Kraft's paper and look at the Cohen paper.
Okay, we've got a few more questions in the chat as well. I think Dave was going to ask that one, or is he coming in? Here he comes. Mute.
Sorry. Right, where are we up to? Right, so does video recording the lesson make the coaching a lot more effective, or can it be effective without recording? And that was from Lindsay.
Yes, really good question, Lindsay. I think video recording of the lesson is very often a really good thing. It will help with at least 2 of those 5 gateways. Firstly, having a video recorded lesson is really good for helping the teacher develop their kind of perceptive abilities, because rather than just talking about it, you just screen the video and you're like what should you have noticed in this video which you didn't notice when in the lesson? Like that's really like great coaching. And then also part of helping teachers to make a change, really like their step knowledge or their strategic knowledge, is about this gap analysis thing. So basically, what does great look like, which the video won't help with, but like you can model that. And then, but then like this is the kind of comes from Bambrick Santoya really, comes from See It, Name It, Do It coaching, is basically like, where are you and what do you need to do? What's the criteria by which you move from place A to place B? And again, having a video basically makes gap analysis work like really, really impactful and really easy. So basically, yeah, it can be great to have a video. At the same time, like it's reasonably labor intensive. Sometimes teachers don't like being filmed. Sometimes it can make students go a bit nuts. So if you're gonna do that kind of stuff, you've just got to make sure that like everyone's comfortable. But yeah, like if it's part of it and everyone's agreed and it doesn't mess up the lesson, I think it's a really good thing to have.
I think that's possibly, thank you. I think that's possibly where, yeah, after listening to that and stuff, it was like, how do we just make people feel comfortable, Josh, with the instructional coaching? Because it's quite
a shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a massive shift, isn't it? And it's and it as whilst despite how much we might all say that we really want feedback because we want to improve, I think when we're going down the instructional coaching stage, because it is so sort of, I suppose, microscopic, yeah. How do we get people on board for it in that sense? How do you it's those habits, isn't it? How do you change those habits? How do you get past the barriers that are going to be there so that it can just be successful? Right.
It's a good question. Dave, did you have a little addition to that, like a little tag on that question?
Yeah, only because it is so intense. Like, how do you take that element of the receiver of the feedback and the coaching, that it doesn't become something that they perceive as being personal to them, rather than, it's feedback about your, not you as a person or a practitioner, but actually how we're going to shift and improve you. And to really, I suppose, motivate them to engage in the process rather than feel like it's something that's being done to them.
Sorry, because I was going to say, because I suppose how actually we're going to shift the entire processes for everybody. So because it's a whole thing, isn't it? It's not yeah.
Can I say Donna has provided clarity here. How do you establish the
There we
coaching relationship? There we go. Donna, thank you for that.
What took 3 people?
Hey, whoa, Cal, I was not part of it.
Donna, you're going to be
Help me
my
out.
coach. Sit cutting through the noise. All right, yes. Good. They're hard questions. So like the comfort thing, I think it's that, you know, there's a lot of that, you know, instructional coaching, it seems on the surface to be a panacea, right? It's like everyone's raving about it. All the research evidence suggests, like, you know, this and that, it adds 2 months per year to student progress, this and that. But like the reality of it is, and the reason why I actually like it is because it's actually really hard for schools to get it right. But that if you get it right, you have done so much more than just like bring in a coaching to your school. Like you've kind of had to transform large aspects of your culture. So the first thing about like how you make people feel comfortable is like there needs to be a culture in the school, I think, or if it's not in the school, you need to set it up of modeling and deliberate practice, because without that culture being there, those things are the really big kind of embarrassment or awkwardness or like feeling icky barrier which people have to face. I think that like setting that culture is actually surprisingly not as hard as you might think, but like you can do something to ruin it like that. And that is basically like apologizing that you're going to make people practice, or practicing in a way that is embarrassed and awkward yourself. So like, I'm saying these things because I've done this like so many times in the past, been like, you know, the old, oh, we're going to do some practice now. Sorry, guys, the awkward part. Like everyone who runs PD has said something like that. That is like the bit strongest message of like, this is a weird thing and it's not part of what we do. So for me, like just working really hard on my own, like unashamed, non-embarrassed modeling and using practice has been something that's really, really important and really hard to do. But like once you get it, I think if the whole leadership team of the school can basically like model that, it makes it a lot easier. And the second thing is like this contracting process, which is essentially like never doing something to someone. You know, coaching needs to be agreed. Like, although, you know, in lots of schools that I work at or with, coaching is a kind of offer for everyone, and I think it should be. You know, it's not, you can't impose learning on a teacher. You can't impose teacher change on a teacher. Like it has to come from them because it's about them figuring out how to enact it in their own context. So part of that is just like agreeing, like, and also talking about what they like or don't like. Like if the teacher feels really uncomfortable about, you know, for example, being filmed, like don't do it. But like that kind of gentle contracting process where you just have a kind of human conversation is super important in building that. Then the third part of that question was like how you stop the kind of feeling of like being judged. It is also a kind of a difficult one to answer. Like the first thing, again, it comes back to school culture. Like if the school has a judging culture and at the same time you're trying to bring in a coaching culture, it's going to be very hard to do. Like no matter all the lip service to coaching being divorced from performance management in the world, like if there is judgmental performance management, which is kind of abrasive, it's very hard to make this kind of very like, you know, nice, collaborative, just everyone caring about getting better thing. And then there's just stuff you can do in your language as a coach, like moving away from like I liked or I loved, which are kind of, Lemov writes about this in Practice Perfect. Like you just like this thing, these are the facts. Like I noticed is like one of my favorite things to say, because it's just like this happened. Like what was the likely impact of that, and what can we do to like change it? And then finally, like, so Rachel has said, is humility an important quality for coaches? Like, yes, I think it is. But I think like how you display humility is by like being a subject of coaching as well as doing it. Like if you're going to coach someone else, you need to be really receptive to being coached. Like I don't really think that there should be instructional coaches who are not receiving coaching for their own teaching. I think it sends the wrong message, and I think it just like you risk being too divorced from like how it feels. And I think that's how you display humility, is like, you know, a school where everyone receives coaching and gives it is a school where like you don't have lots of these cultural problems, because it just feels normal to be working on something.
So I suppose, is it worth, sorry, Lee.
It's okay.
So I suppose if it's this idea that it has to be really closely aligned to culture, and like you say, we can't communicate coaching as a priority, or coaching is what we do here, if it then conflicts with various other things on, you know, leadership agenda or whole school agenda, it just doesn't make sense. So with this idea of kind of alignment, would you then argue the case that there is essentially almost a coaching curriculum? Like what you're talking about really is almost that perhaps the implementation of instructional coaching would look very different in year 1 as it would to year 2 and year 3, and almost kind of making that quite explicit to schools when you're going in and working with schools about what that might look like.
Yeah, I haven't thought of it as like a curriculum for schools before, and I really like that. I really like that way of putting it. Definitely, I think that there's like that going through these kind of stages of building up towards like this mega coaching culture where kind of everyone, I think in my eyes, you want to get to a place where like everyone participates as both a giver and a receiver. But like I've made the mistake of just going straight into that, and it's really hard. Like I did that at South Bank and it didn't work perfectly straight away. When I work with schools now, like, yeah, we work through a lot of like some intermediary stages, like stage 1 being like recruit some kind of pathfinder coaches, not just your senior leadership team, but like people who you think will be good at it and who care, and actually offer it to anyone. Train those guys and have them just do it with each other. Like at the same time, you need to be doing work with the rest of your staff on building a culture where coaching is something that they're receptive to it, and that can be like increasing the amount of deliberate practice and modeling that happens in whole school PD. It can be about like slowly stripping away some of the more abrasive performance management elements, and then the kind of that stage 1, and then stage 2 might be like some form of a rollout where like those coaches work with some teachers. Again, another really important kind of like part of the curriculum here, or a misconception would be only have it being done on what's the right way of describing it? Some of your weaker teachers. Basically, like that's a culture ruiner, because everyone's like, how come it's just those guys? And so like rather than doing that, it's just like sometimes I've done just the ITTs or just the ITTs NQTs, because that's a nice group. You can just be like, it's those guys because it should be those guys, and then offer it as an opt-in. And then the next stage would be for everyone. And then at some point after that, it would be like, and then you recruit your next wave of coaches until you build up to full capacity, would be a way that I would kind of go through that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I really like that, because I think it's that idea of you know, kind of resistance to change, and being aware of that and managing that tension, and also making sure that you carry it out as a process that it's almost replicating that scaling up, isn't it? So that it's like you said, the difference between enforcing this is what we're doing and opting in and bringing people, you know, inviting people to the table instead of forcing them to sit there. So yeah, I really like that analogy. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah, I think that's where I was going to go, because I think the first time I met you, Josh, I remember when you presented on this, I remember it being it was delivered as a whole school thing. It wasn't kind of in a sense, well, I felt it was this, it wasn't delivered as a, like you were saying, it's not us as the middle leaders, senior leaders who are going in and coaching, because actually there was a level at every single point. And actually the senior leaders actually were ultimately being coached by somebody else, and everybody. So there was this big chain of events. Everybody's kind of being coached. And so I suppose that was where I thought maybe the buy-in comes in, because actually, the buy-in, when I say the buy-in, obviously, I don't know if it would have been scary for everybody to just suddenly go like, oh yeah, okay, I'm now going to be a coach.
Yeah.
But it's that thing, isn't it? It is that modeling. It is that, and everybody's in the same place and everybody's in the same position, and you've all been coached and you're all learning. And I think that's what I find quite exciting about this as well. Like, can I also ask though, Josh and Kat, can you now write a book on instructional sorry, the curriculum? Can we have the curriculum
Really busy.
of instructional coaching?
I am trying to do that, but it's pretty hard. It's not easy. It's not easy. But yeah, maybe. And if I do write it, I shall steal coaching curriculum for schools.
There you go. You are welcome. You can have that for free, Josh.
Somebody's asked, how much does content expertise matter?
So yeah, so there's an interesting piece of research which states basically that like it's in that craft paper, I think, which is like how much of coaching needs to be subject specific and how much needs to be generic. The answer is like 50-50. It's actually slightly weighted, slightly very like negligible, but slightly more on the generic side. I think that if you're coaching someone on subject specific content, you need to be a subject expert. Right? Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And like so when I help people to coach, I kind of serve them up lots of stuff that helps them with generic coaching. So they don't really need to be generic teaching expert. But like because there's so much more meat in, there's so much more stuff in subject expert like teaching, which, I haven't been able to codify it in the way that like, I've worked on codifying generic teaching on powerful action steps and stuff. So yes, that said, I don't think that like that content expertise coaching only is good. I think I've done that before, like only have people doing it within English. And I think like what happens is people tend to talk about lesson planning the whole time. It ends up being a little bit more talky because like these people are really familiar with each other and like chatting about, Macbeth is fun and you can learn from it, but like, and that's good stuff sometimes, but like you need to balance it out with generic as well. But yeah, you can't have that is an area where like coaching expertise really does matter. You can't really have like someone coaching an English teacher on English teaching without knowing about English teaching. Yeah. So yes, good question. And then there's another one from Michelle. What do you think is the best way to train coaches and check the ongoing quality of coaches? Yeah, training coaches is hard because there's two facets to it. One is you need to give them this kind of, or help them with this granular knowledge of teaching, which again, I've tried and attempted to kind of mechanize in various ways. We're at 8 o'clock. What happens with these things? These things just sort of drift over, or do we need to kill it?
No, we can keep going.
I mean, if it's up to Jake, you'll still be here at 10:30, so just watch it. But
to be fair, Josh, it's entirely up to you because you've given us your time this evening, so it's it's up to you.
I've had a good time. So what were we saying? So basically, training coaches, granular knowledge, you need to give it to them. But I've attempted to mechanize that in various ways by like giving coaches diagnostic support. You need to help them with like understanding how to do practice. Like with every action step, there's like some stuff you need to do with a teacher to help them enact it. Like what do you need to plan? What resources do you need? How does deliberate practice work? And again, I've tried to mechanize that in a certain way. Then you need to give them help with like the how of coaching, like how to do deliberate practice, how to model. Modeling's hard because you really need to actually have a mental model of a technique yourself. Unless, of course, like ambition, you supply videos for each technique, which is another kind of cheat. But really, like, it's, being a great coach without loads of support is basically like knowing the entire of teaching. And then also having these kind of like these teaching skills, as it were, in like making someone practice, etc., etc. So it's, checking quality is a different thing. Like, you need to have access to the data on coaching. So basically, when coaching happens, there's 60 coaching observations a week. Like, you need to look at the action steps. That's the first thing. If you don't have access to those, like, you know, you really need to find a way. So is every action step appropriate? And then the other thing would be like coaching on coaching, observing the coach, like watching coaches do what they do, observing a lesson with them, and kind of, you know, it gets quite a meta, but basically giving them feedback on that is a really helpful process as well. That probably didn't answer that as well as I could have, but what can you do?
I thought I'm whispering. My boy's asleep upstairs. Josh, I love that. Thank you so much. You're right, I could go on for hours of talking about this sort of thing. Josh, so one question from me is, so we're saying about, you know, everyone's talking about, we've got to codify everything nowadays, haven't we? I.e., what does that model look like? Do you think really senior leadership teams need to get together and before any coaching goes ahead and go, this is the model that we want in our school of X, Y, and Z, and then go with the coaching, or do you think coaching, or does it have to come together? What comes first, chicken or egg?
I think I think it's got to be like, if schools don't have a conception of quality for them and a shared language around it that's theirs, again, like, that's a kind of important part of the coaching curriculum for schools, is like, develop at your own shared language. Because if you don't have that, if schools don't have it, then, you know, what is everyone talking about when they're doing coaching? So yeah, I think like codifying that, knowing what great looks like here, what practices great look like, and like what those practices. Yeah, I think it's just that needs to come first.
Josh, you said about, you can leave at any point, by the way. So you said about the leverage leadership stuff, so the waterfall effect. Don't laugh, Luke. Don't laugh. We've got Josh all to ourselves, haven't we? Do you think that schools could do something like that, where they would go, actually, these are what we say as a school. This is our model. This is what we want, and this is where we want to start. And then because you said about coming back to it and interleaving it. Actually, could that be a good way of doing it? Actually, these are what we think it is, and then we waterfall that.
Yeah.
Could that be effective?
Yeah, definitely. That's making your own sequence, isn't it? Again, like, I've got one, but like, that's kind of not right for everyone. It's just for me in my context. But and like,
could you share it?
Well, it lives there. I didn't want to. This is just grotesque product placement, which I didn't want to go down the road of.
Come on,
do it.
Keep it coming. This is good.
Makes me feel awkward, but okay. Well, it's here. I could probably, like, do you want me to quickly show you what I mean?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
All right. This is now going. Oh no, I can't share my screen, so I can't do it.
Oh, do you want me to make the host again, or?
Yeah, host.
Josh might have to enjoy his evening, I'm feeling. Do you want me to see if you can, or you've put it in the chat box, so we can probably
basically on there. That's better. On there, there's this thing called the sequence. It's essentially my best guess at a novice to expert coaching curriculum with you know, which starts off with these big areas and takes teachers down to sufficiently, so like much more granular, and then down to steps, etc. So, but like, that's for me. And then when I work with schools, one of the first things I do with them is like, which parts of this do you like? Because like, that took me like 6 years. So no one wants to do, it's like there's 50,000 words of content in there, but like all the big Russian dolls, like, so no one wants to do that work, you know. But like, so what I help schools to do is basically go like, well, I like that bit and that bit, but I don't think that bit's important. And then like, but I want it in this order, and I want to change the title, what everything's called. And so that is like, yeah, that is kind of what I mean by the process of making your own, what good looks like coaching curriculum is important for schools to do.
Basically, you've created a tool for schools to really develop their own coaching plans in their schools, haven't you? Dead easy. Yeah. That's
kind of the idea.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you so much, Josh. You've given me loads to think about.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Josh, thank you. We might let you go now. I've absolutely loved it.
Yeah, sorry, Josh.
No, it's all good. It's all good. It's been nice chatting and meeting with you.
We'll have to get you back to Grimsby, back to, you know, because you came from here, back to Grimsby for a live one, for a real pint.
Yeah, Josh, when we do get to have a pub, would you please come and present for us? Because we would love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, if this was talking about teaching in a pub, there'd be no stopping me. So like, yeah, I'd be up for that. Did this actually happen in a pub in real life?
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
really.
Josh, it's called Brewhead, isn't it? Like,
I thought it was about tea. I thought it was like teachers who are obsessed with tea. That was my analysis.
This is